Well, you know the old Santa Ana quote, you are destined to relive history if you don't know it, and we Canadians generally don't know it. However, we can address that deficiency with John Boyko, an historian who's written many, many books, and we're going to touch on a few safety and security issues with him today. Welcome back, John.
Thank you.
Now, would you agree with the general premise that both history and culture is largely manufactured through myth and through story and legend? For example, there's a wonderful statue of John Harvard at Harvard University, yet no one knows what he actually looked like. The Liberty Bell has nothing to do with liberty, it's just an incompetent bell that kept breaking. Battle of Bunker Hill was lost, Washington lost at least 6 of his 9 battles, and on it goes. Not a very happy comment on your profession as an historian, but what do you say about that?
The Battle of Bunker Hill wasn't even fought at Bunker Hill, so we could go on and on. I think that you're right in that history is essentially the stories that we decide to tell ourselves. And I would even go further. I would say that a country is nothing more than the stories we tell and that we agree to tell ourselves and that we agree to agree upon. And beyond that, I think that a country, any country, not just Canada, is essentially an ongoing conversation. And it is a conversation about who we are, who we aspire to be, what matters, what doesn't matter, who should be invited to the party, who serves, who eats, and that conversation is ongoing, and that's okay. That's what every country needs to be. A part of that conversation is our music and our art and what we do for fun, whether it's entertainment or that we watch or things that we participate in. And history is a part of that ongoing conversation. It isn't the whole part, it's an important part, but it is something that it must always be looked at, must always be revived, must always be looked at in new ways. That's what keeps historians in business. That's why we have 1,000 books written about Lincoln or Kennedy, and we have new biographies coming out about Sir John A. Macdonald, and we have an ongoing conversation now about should Macdonald's statues be torn down or should we be revered? This conversation is essential to our democracy. It should be welcomed.
Well, in a way, you've fallen right into a trap that I didn't know I'd set, because when you speak of a nation state or a country as a composite of the stories and the music and the culture and the other elements, language and so on, you're also speaking directly to the current assertion by Indigenous peoples that they were such entities before settlers arrived, and they are such entities now, engaged in a vigorous protection of those very elements that you say are essential to their state or nationhood.
Yes, absolutely. And there was no question that Indigenous people were here before the European people arrived. There's no question about that. There is no question that the early interactions between the Europeans, be it in French or English or Spanish or whatever, were very much nation to nation. We needed them as economic trading partners. We then needed them as political and especially military allies. The War of 1812, for example, Canada surely would have lost without Tecumseh and a number of Indigenous nations fighting as they did on our behalf. And so, yes, these nation-to-nation conversations took place. Now, what Indigenous nations are quite rightfully struggling for now is for a resumption of those nation-to-nation conversations and that relationship. And it is absolutely within their rights to do so. It is absolutely within the rights of the Canadian government to fight for the rights of all Canadians in the evolution of this relationship. And it will happen. And there will be ugly parts and parts with which we should rejoice. But that is part of our conversation going forward.
Now, let me draw a bit of a complex logic chain here, but I think a ruling from an historian would be helpful. Americans like to say that the British don't have a written constitution, to which I say nonsense. It is hundreds of written documents, court rulings going back to the Magna Carta. Of course it was written, not in one document, but written. some people today say, well, the indigenous peoples did not have a written record of their laws and so on, to which I say, nonsense. The two-row wampum belt is a hard and fast and concrete record of a treaty, as much as the cuneiform writing of the Cappadocians in their trading treaty with Syria is a written, known record. There might be some metaphor in there, there might be some symbolism in there, but to criticize that from a culture where Her Majesty holds a scepter and sits on the stone of Scone, I think is a bit disingenuous, wouldn't you say?
I absolutely agree. Just because the record is not written does not mean that there is not a record. Also, if we need written record, we have the treaties. We have the treaties that we, as Canadians, have essentially ignored, and now those are coming back. So I absolutely agree with you.
Could you speak to this myth of Canada being the peaceful, tolerant kingdom? I mean, I've even debated some Americans where they say, oh, well, you were much more peaceful country than America. Oh, yes, all except we were in World War I and World War II before the Americans and the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion and so on and so forth. And the shameful part of not being a tolerant and peaceful entity is our history of slavery and relationships with indigenous people. Speak to those, please.
Yeah, I think that what I said is that we are the stories that we agree upon. We are also the stories that we determine that we are not going to tell. We are part of the memories that we refuse to remember. My second book was called Last Steps to Freedom. It's the evolution of Canadian racism. And I won't go over everything in that book, but what it talked about was the fact that Canada was established as a racist state and continued as a racist state until very recent times. We had slavery. We had quotas on who could come into the country based on nothing but race, a Chinese head tax, a Japanese head tax. We had quotas about how many Jews could go into various universities. And we stuck to those quotas. We had situations where African Canadians could not obtain business licenses or purchase properties in various parts of cities. And that right into the 1960s. We had racial segregation in the 1960s. I talked in that book, which came out in 1995, I think, about Viola Desmond, who I'm very happy now to see recognized on the currency. And Viola Desmond was doing everything that Parks was going to do later in Halifax, trying to end the segregation in Halifax. So I think if we looked at simply that aspect of Canada, race relations in Canada, and we would hold that mirror up to ourselves, we would say maybe we shouldn't be so sanctimonious in looking at the United States and tisking them for their race relations. If their original sin was slavery, our original sin was our relationship with the indigenous people. But it goes even beyond that to those things that I've mentioned and more. The race riots that happened in 1905, that happened in Vancouver, and the race riots that happened in Toronto with the Christie Pitts riot, which was an anti-Jewish race riot that lasted for hours and caused damage to people and property. If we look at Canada and we really look at what our country is, rather than the myths of what we would like to believe about ourselves, I think we are richer as a people.
Well, and maybe that is the Santa Ana remedy, to know our history so we don't repeat it, because there's a lot of, especially with indigenous peoples, there's a lot of, oh, well, you know, that was the past and that was then, and people didn't know any better, and let's get over it. I mean, as I think it was William Faulkner said, it's not that we can get over the past, it's that it's not actually the past.
Yes.
It's still something we're living with.
Absolutely. A gentleman that I have great respect for, who lives close to me here in Lakefield, Ontario, was speaking with me about the fact that the RCMP came to his house when he was a child, and they were rounding up. He's an Indigenous man, Ojibwe, and he was part of what was going to be scooped and taken away. His father taught him how to live in the woods, how to live in the woods for days at a time. He was 8, and he was living in the woods to avoid the RCMP coming and taking him away, kidnapping him in what was a part of a cultural genocide. Now, is that ancient history? I was talking to this gentleman. That's not ancient history. This is his memory as a child.
And I was talking to an Indigenous elder who said she was told by her parents, don't tell anyone that you're Indigenous because they'll come and take you away. And that's a living memory for her too.
Exactly.
John, let's get to some general myths about history and Canada's history as well. Those are very powerful, and I think I need some time for them to sink in. When Richard Nixon wrote many books, and they were certainly learned books, and he was a learned person, whatever else he was criticized for not being a trained historian, whatever that is. Conrad Black is a trained historian, I believe, having a master's degree, but tell me, what is an historian? I took a history course as an undergraduate, but I wouldn't call myself an historian. Do you need a master's? There's no clinical practice. Do you need to go back in time? I mean, what makes an historian?
An historian is somebody who is interested and studies history. That's an historian. If you are reading books about history and you are truly looking at what history is, then you're an historian. You are not someone who is looking back in history with a nostalgic bent and just want to relive something. That's nostalgia. Nostalgia is not history. You don't want to collect Elvis records and things. That's nostalgia. That's fine. I'm trying to save this old house that's being torn down in the neighborhood. That's nostalgia. But an historian is someone who is studying history and concerned about history and looks at history as a way in which we can organize our thoughts about what happened then, so that we can look at the present with more nuanced understanding. Now, that said, there are people who believe that an historian is someone who has a PhD and is working in a university, researching and writing books with the university aspects. I don't believe that's true. I was told once when I was at an event in Toronto promoting my biography of Bennett, I delivered the speech and it went over well, and a number of people were lined up, and I was signing books. I thought it was a marvelous event. And afterwards, this person who is an adjunct professor came up to me and he said, you know, they're gunning for you. And I asked, who is gunning for me? And they said, well, now this was a number of years ago, I'm not quite so young anymore. And he said, they don't like you. The established historians don't like you because you're too young. You're writing popular books that are actually being read, and you're not a PhD historian, so therefore you're not legitimate. And
well, you've addressed at least one of those things. Cleverly dyeing your hair gray to look older, I think, is succeeding. Let me get to Canadian myths then. And I think that your definition of, let's say, a practical historian, a working historian, a public intellectual historian is a good definition. Let's take John A. Macdonald, father of Confederation, tenacious in inviting himself to the Charlottetown Conference and all this sort of stuff. But you've pointed out in one of your books that he actually gave up on Confederation, and it was George Brown who dragged him kicking and screaming back into the project. Is that hyperbole or about right?
No, that is very much true. Confederation as a notion was being talked about long before 1864, when the Confederation Conferences happened in Charlottetown and Quebec City. And it was seen as a way of solving a number of issues. And one of them was, if we were together as all of these colonies as one, then we'd be more powerful and able to move west and able to build railroads. And there were a number of railroad men who were therefore trying to push Confederation for that reason. And another was the most dominant idea was the political system that was established essentially after the rebellions in 1837 is not working anymore. We need a double majority. We need a majority and then a majority of French people in order to vote in this new colony of Quebec and Ontario put together called Canada. And it was simply an unstable political system. And if we can form confederation, we could form a federal and a system with provinces and the national government, and that would work much better. Now, MacDonald at that time was not interested in expansion west. He was interested in expansion, but certainly not west. He wasn't interested in railroads, and he certainly wasn't interested in throwing out the system that was working quite well for him. He was a powerful man, and he was having a successful political career, and he was expert at working the system as it was. And he did not want to do that. He was also afraid of a federal system that would give more power to the French-speaking people in Quebec. The French-speaking people in Quebec were a part of his power base, and he believed that he would lose that. So he was looking at it from a very personal point of view. When the Civil War happened, and the Civil War looked like it was going to spill over and have dangerous repercussions for Canada, in that Lincoln might simply turn the soldiers around and take Canada after he was done with the South, then he was convinced that, yes, we need to do this. He was convinced by George Brown that the current system, yes, was unworkable given these new circumstances, and we needed to do something else in order to make ourselves more powerful, to stand against the Americans, and to build a system that would work better. So that's a long answer to say, yeah, he was against Confederation in the beginning. He was even against Confederation in the early part of 1864, until Brown and Cartier convinced him that this is an idea whose time had come. And then he got behind it, gangbusters, and made it happen.
So when Mitt Romney famously said he was for the bill before he voted against it, he was really channeling John A. Macdonald.
Well, there's a whole lot more to that story too, but yeah. And I like when a politician admits that he has changed his mind, because there is now a new situation, new information, and so therefore I have changed my mind. And I wish we would stop blaming politicians for flip-flopping when there is a new circumstance around and new information involves. Change their mind. That's okay. A changing of a mind is a sign that there is a mind.
And Brian Mulrooney's famous first quote about free trade was, "All have, none of it." And then he did it, and it was successful. I don't want to leave George Brown, because there are two interesting things about George Brown, the famous editor of the Globe, now known as the Globe and Mail, yes, and leader of the Reform Party. When we're so overwhelmed with American history, we know that Horace Greeley, the editor of The World, which gave its name to the World Series, it has nothing to do with the Earth or the globe or the inhabitants of this sphere. Horace Greeley said, "Go west, young man," very famous quote and very famous person. But at the same time that Horace Greeley was saying that and becoming famous, George Brown's newspaper was outselling him by a wide margin. He was more successful.
Absolutely, yeah. The Globe was an incredibly powerful paper. It became the Globe and Mail when it in 1936 when it merged with the Mail and Empire paper. But it was the Globe, and the Globe was powerful because it not only was widely read, because it was distributed all across Canada. It was the first paper that could be distributed so that you could read it in Ottawa and Hamilton and Peterborough and all over the place. All other papers were local, so that made it powerful. It was also powerful because he had a definite point of view. All newspapers have a point of view, and he had a definite point of view. And it was the Reform point of view, not the Reform Party that we think of, Preston Manning, but the Reform Party of that day that was essentially the Liberal Party, became the Liberal Party. And that point of view was such that he was able to sell Canadians on a number of ideas. If I could be so bold as to say sell Canadians. He sold the idea that we should stand up for the rights of all people. He was a strong advocate of the abolitionist movement. He was a strong advocate even of the early women's movement. His wife was a very powerful and influential person in his life, and he saw women as that they should be more powerful and influential in society. He advocated that. He advocated again for Confederation when those ideas came forward. So he is a very important Canadian, and I think all Canadians should know more about him.
John, as a recovering journalist, I was very interested in the history of newspaper distribution which took a big leap forward with USA Today and satellite distribution. Then the Globe and Mail did the same. But you're saying that long ago, in the 1860s, George Brown got his paper distributed through what was essentially most of Canada. Was it by horse and buggy, or
It was, and yeah, and you wouldn't read the paper the same day, obviously, because the transportation system certainly wasn't in what it is now. And he also created new ways of working with the printing press so that he could print things quicker and so that he could print more. So he technologically advanced newspapers, and through the distribution, he came up with the notion, basically, that there could be more than just local news. So he was a very important man.
Now, many Canadians watch too much American TV and coverage of American politics, and we hear about the Federalist Papers. And Federalist 42 said this, and 37 said that, and Madison said something. Many of these were simply articles in the newspaper, sometimes written under a pseudonym or sometimes anonymously. And what weight they should have in a constitutional argument is a bit lost on me. It does give some insight into the thinking of some of America's founding fathers. But while those are talked about a lot, no one other than you seems to talk about the 3 months worth of articles, and I don't know whether it was daily or weekly, but 3 months worth of articles that George Brown wrote and had written in the Globe on the merits of Confederation. What were these, and why aren't they talked about much?
Well, it's not, I want to be first. It was not just me that is talking about them, but thank you for that. When we decided as Canadians, or at least the Canadian leaders decided in Charlottetown and then in Quebec City in 1864 that Confederation should happen, that didn't mean that it was automatically going to happen. It had to be ratified in Canada and in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And of course, they tried to ratify it in Prince Edward Island as well, but failed. And what that meant was that we're now going to debate the deal. So the deal was struck, and now we are going to determine whether, as Canadians, we wanted the deal or not. It wasn't going to be a referendum. The leaders were going to decide, the elected leaders were going to decide, but it was 3 years, or about 2 years, 2.5 years of debate. And George Brown played an essential role in that debate because he had the Globe. He had this beautiful megaphone through which he could argue for Confederation, and he did. He talked about it economically, he talked about it politically, and he talked about the potential, as I said, to move west and to be a more powerful entity, still within the British Empire, still with the British system, parliamentary system, but with the federal system that exists in the United States, where there's states and the national government. That would allow Canada, that would allow New Brunswick and the other maritime provinces, but especially importantly, allow Quebec to remain independent of the other countries with respect to language and education and all the other powers that were given to the provinces. MacDonald went around the country, McGee went around the country, and others went around the country arguing for them. There's a great number of speeches that MacDonald delivered as well. And they are in some books that I've read called the Confederation Debate. Brilliant in arguing, much like the Federalist Papers did, saying, here's why this is a good idea. We should get behind this. Brown was essential, though, because he had that megaphone.
John, we don't have equal time rules here on YouTube. However, I think because you've spent a lot of your life sifting through dusty files and books in libraries and going as far afield that I know of to the Diefenbaker archives at the University of Saskatoon, and you've probably been in the Homestead, and you've been in all the nooks and crannies. Is there something that I've missed asking you about that you'd like to speak about for the last minute or so?
Well, what I would like to do is to ask that people read more about their history, because the arguments that I hear in the United States right now, as so many Americans are shouting past each other, they're not really discussing anything with each other, is they're simply shouting at each other. I'm on Twitter, and sometimes I think I should get off Twitter because it seems like it's too many people just screaming in the dark. If more people read their history and understood their history, then I think the conversations that we are having would perhaps be a little bit more intelligent, and the conversations and debates we have would be a little bit more productive. I saw it not just in the Americans, but in the last Canadian election, where a number of people were making stands that if they knew a little bit more about their history, I think it would be a little bit more informed, and therefore they would be better able to make their points. Not just in order to make their point, but to understand the points being made, counter to them, and maybe even doing what I was saying politicians should do, to say, you know what, that's right, I should reconsider my point of view. You can only do that if you've read the history.
Well, enthusiastic agreement, John, and I'm sure that you would agree that we could add the words, listen to your history, talk about your history in the Indigenous community, because in addition to the written history that there is, or the written symbols that there are, if you ask an elder, if you talk about your history, you will gain a similar level of understanding.
I agree.
Thank you, John Boyko.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.